The triangular bayonet, or indeed the saw-backed bayonet. Were these banned by the Geneva Convention? Let's answer that question and also have a little look at the famous German butcher bayonet of World War I. Fixed bayonets or detached bayonets, both of them can be used either in hand or on the end of a rifle. And of course, World War I in many ways was famous for its bayonet charges, trench raids, and the many interesting bayonets that come from World War I. Now, this isn't actually from World War I, this is an earlier Martini Henry, but I picked this out because it's got a triangular section bayonet on it. Now, if you look in various forums and Facebook pages and X discussions and various other places online, you'll find various people proudly proclaiming that the saw-backed blade or serrated blade, or indeed the triangular blade, as found on many bayonets here, this socket bayonet, are banned under the Geneva Convention. Well, let's dispel that straight away. No, they're not. They're absolutely not. So I looked into the Geneva Convention, I did a little bit of research on this. I was pretty sure that it was BS anyway, and it turns out it is. So there is, I believe it's Article 23 of the Geneva Convention, talks about weapons which cause undue suffering. And some people have taken this to extrapolate this to the triangular section bayonet, we'll talk about that in a second, and also serrated and sawback blades, and we'll get to those and cover those in some depth in a second. Now, first of all, let's dispel the triangular blade. Why do they say this? Well, it has been said by various people that triangular wounds, stab wounds, are harder to fix and stitch up and things like this than other edged wounds, double-edged or single-edged blades. Is this true? I'm not a surgeon, I can't answer that question categorically. However, I would think that the major concern if you're stabbed by something like a bayonet like this is the fact that you've been stabbed by a large spike. And at the end of the day, just big picture, okay, triangular section bayonets have been used for hundreds, literally hundreds of years, okay? So they were used right the way through the 19th century. They'd been used extensively all the way back in the 18th century. So pretty much as long as the socket bayonet existed, pretty much, the triangular section blade, as found on a small sword incidentally, or certain other cavalry swords like the Preval blade used by an experimental blade used by French cavalry. The triangular blade is very stiff, very good for thrusting, and it was used for that reason. It wasn't triangular to cause horrific wounds, it was triangular because that works well as a stabbing shape. So triangular blades used right the way through the 18th, 19th and well into the 20th century, and they're still being used in the Second World War on certain types of rifle, even though by and large sword and knife bayonets are taken over. So I will dispel with, get rid of this, and let's move on to serrated blades. So many people have said with near mythical status that this is the, incidentally, 1898/05 German bayonet. This type has a sawback on it. Now, not all of them have that. This was commonly known, this general type of bayonet, the 9805, was known as the butcher bayonet because the shape of it, not because of the sawback, but because the shape of the blade is like a butcher's knife. Okay, so if you go into an abattoir or a butcher's shop, you'll see that they have large knives like this for processing meat, kind of this shape, but they're usually much thinner. This is a thicker blade because it has to be able to stand up to more punishment, and the torque and leverage are being added onto the end of a German rifle. Okay, so this model of bayonet was in use from 1898 onwards well into the First World War, and so up until about 1917-ish, 1917-18, this was the predominant model, not the sawback one, but the plain-backed type was the predominant model of bayonet being used by German forces. But after that, other forms, smaller and more simple bladed bayonets became more common, and they prevailed well into the Second World War. Although these, funnily enough, were still around in the interwar years and were sometimes given as awards or prizes to NCOs and private soldiers. Anyway, so why does this one have a sawback, and what's the sawback for? Well, quite simply, the sawback is there for pioneers, so people who are out there to make fortifications, clear land for artillery emplacements, this kind of thing, sappers, And NCOs, so like sergeants and corporals, often got these. So these are in a minority. So the majority of this type of butcher bayonet, the 1898/05, actually has a plain back on it. So these ones with the serrated back or sawback are less common. They maybe make between 5 and 10% of all of those butcher bayonets made. And so these are more sought after by collectors because there are fewer of them, quite simply. And also, they kind of look cool, don't they? This one is actually quite an early one. It doesn't have a date on it, but it has the leather scabbard. Later ones have a steel scabbard. This actually has the leather scabbard, so it's got steel mounts at top and bottom with a frog there, rather with a button to connect to a frog to connect to the belt. So this probably dates to either before the First World War or the very beginning of the war years, maybe 1914, 1915, I think, as far as I can tell, but it doesn't have a date on it. It does have the Solingen Makers mark on here, has various other numbers and approval markings, and it does, interestingly, have this metal plate. I'll just show that there, this metal plate along the back of the grip. Now that metal plate was added because they found that the wooden grips during extended periods of firing the rifle, those wooden grips would start to get burned. So they actually added on this metal plate in the war years, I think, beginning of the war kind of period. They added on this metal plate to protect the wooden grips from the heat of the muzzle of the barrel, essentially. And you'll also notice it doesn't have a ring at the back. So I'll show you another bayonet in a second, but here it's actually got the little part here which rests against the barrel, but it doesn't actually have a full ring because it was found that this connector was strong enough by itself and the ring was causing problems, essentially. Simple little drop quill on at the front, and that's primarily there to stop your hand sliding up onto the grip when you're using it like a sidearm. But additionally, when it's mounted on a rifle, it gives you, much like a partisan or a spontoon, it gives you something to push against. So bear in mind they did a lot of bayonet training. Just pick up the rifle with the bayonet. So if you're essentially fighting with someone else with a bayonet, having a projecting lug on the side, or quill on in this case, enables you to push their weapon aside, parry, push it aside and get in your own stab. So it's quite a useful implement, whether you're using this in hand or whether it's mounted on the rifle. Now this one has been quite well service sharpened, incidentally, and they have service sharpened the back edge and all the way down the front edge. So it's very much intended to be used either as, for chopping stuff or a big knife, or as a trench weapon potentially. In a trench raid you could use this in hand, or of course using it on the end of the rifle as the bayonet. Now let's get back to that saw edge. So a lot of mythology around these 98/05 butcher bayonets, and the fact that this saw edge was banned by the Geneva Convention, and that's why after 1917 they stopped using these, and in some cases ground them off. So you find some which step down at the back and have a little kind of recess where they have had a saw edge and it's been ground off. So it's difficult getting to the bottom of this. First of all, as we mentioned, it was not banned by the Geneva Convention. That's a myth. However, there are some sources stating that French and British officials complained about the sawback edges, and therefore the Germans decided to stop issuing them and stop using them and grinding them off from 1917 onwards. Now, I'm skeptical about this as an explanation. However, I'm open to it, and if you know good solid source material to prove this beyond doubt, then I'm happy to see that. However, I haven't seen it so far. My personal theory is that they just found that these sawbacks got in the way. So there are a couple of reasons why they get in the way. Firstly, as a bayonet, okay, so if we just pick up the old plunger here, the big spike, very clearly when a bayonet goes in, it has to come out again. You want it to go in easily, you want it to come out easily. The problem with sawbacks is they actually are harder to go in and potentially harder to come out. Now, lots of people make some gruesome kind of zombie fantasy ideas about these sort of pulling out people's entrails as they come out and stuff. I don't think that will happen for one very simple reason. Let's have a look at this saw. The teeth go upwards, okay, so they don't act as gut hooks, they don't act as any kind of hook. The teeth are pointing that way. So actually, as the blade goes in, it's going to meet a huge amount of resistance, but as it comes out, it will meet almost none. This is a saw that cuts on the push, not on the pull. Conventional European saws usually cut on the push. Japanese saws cut on the pull, incidentally, but this German saw cuts on the push. So all this is going to do is make it harder for the blade to go in, and it won't make really any difference, I don't think, on the way out. So again, I think we're dealing with urban legends, myths here. I don't think we're dealing with reality. The reality is, I think this saw was costly to make, and number one, makes it potentially worse as a bayonet, worse at stabbing. And there's another problem. When you come to sheathe the thing, and when you put the blade in here, it is more likely that those saw edges will create problems inside the scabbard or against the throat. So it's going to be more difficult in many cases to get it in, and potentially maybe more nasty to handle. I don't know. These are all theories based on my observation of the problem with sawbacks. Now, did the Prussians or the Germans, did they invent this? No. So the idea that the French and British in, let's say, 1916 should be complaining about the Germans having sawbacks in a bigger historical context is frankly dumb, okay? I present my first piece of evidence. A British bayonet with a sawback on it. Okay, so this is an earlier 1885 dated Pioneers, well, it's actually an artillery cutlass, or rather hanger bayonet, to go on, in fact, the artillery version of the Martini Henry. It won't fit on this one. Okay, so it's to go on the shorter Martini Henry. Now this was issued to artillery sappers because it was useful to have a saw, in theory. In fact, they don't work very well as saws, it's quite difficult to hold them. But here's an interesting thing. If you look at the design of this, obviously it's a much longer blade because it's intended to be used as a short sword, as a short saber, and the saw is only up here. But notice, when you're using this as a bayonet, this entire portion of the blade is double-edged, and it doesn't interfere, the sawback doesn't interfere with its use as a bayonet or a stabbing implement. The saw is down here, okay, so it doesn't get in the way. It should never encounter the opponent's body. This part of the blade goes in, this part comes out. The sawback isn't part of this process, that is just a tool, okay? The problem with the German version is the sawback goes up too high. So you're only going to be able to get that much of the bayonet in before this becomes a problem of pushing the rest of the blade in. So I actually think this is a worse bayonet blade. It's a cool thing and it's a cool tool and it's intimidating, but it's actually worse as a weapon. Now, my other piece of evidence is that it wasn't just the British using sawbacks. It was everyone at some point, most famously the Swiss. You know, that place where Geneva is, where the Geneva Convention comes from. The Swiss themselves had sawback bayonets, and that's another piece of evidence that nobody at the time saw sawback bayonets as contravening the Geneva Convention, because the Swiss themselves had sawback bayonets. Where did sawbacks come from? They actually come from way back. If we go all the way back to something like the Buckingham knife, all the way back in the 17th century, we have sawbacks on hunting swords and hunting knives, and it's used for dealing with a kill after you've shot it. So after you've shot, let's say, a deer or a boar, you want to remove the legs, you want to, you know, prepare it basically and hang it and that kind of stuff. A saw is useful for taking the limbs off some of the time, or you could just use the saw for clearing branches or whatever, you know, maybe getting bits of wood to make a campfire, that kind of stuff. It's a general purpose bushcraft tool. So the saw is nothing to do with the weapon in many ways. It's purely there as a tool. It's a saw, okay? And interestingly, when they did away with the sawbacks for pioneers in the German army during World War I, they started issuing saws to them because they still need saws. What they found is this is a lousy saw. I have actually cut wood with one of these and it is a pain in the butt. The handle is not well designed for it, it's not comfortable to hold. The saw is great, it's actually really good quality, but they're just not ergonomically suited to sawing. So, I'm gonna, without blathering on too much there, I'm gonna wrap it up there. These are very, very cool things. They stopped being used in 1917. As I mentioned, they did hang around. Obviously, many survived, but they only make up between 5 and 10% of the total number of this model of butcher bayonet. Most butcher bayonets are smooth-backed, but even the butcher bayonet without the sawback was eclipsed by other smaller, more efficient manners of stabbing bayonet. The sawback type occasionally hung around and seems to have occasionally been presented in the interwar years between World War I and World War II because they're cool looking things. But by and large, I think it was a failure as a weapon, and it wasn't because it was horrific under the Geneva Convention or banned under the Geneva Convention, or even particularly because it was a horrific weapon. Because actually, I think it's a more rubbish weapon, it's a less efficient weapon, it's not such a good bayonet as other models of bayonet that were around at the time, which have less problems going in and out and doing the job that they're supposed to do. So there we go. A lot of mythology about even modern 20th century weapons, if we call this modern. Okay, it's over 100 years old now, but relatively modern in history. A lot of mythology, and don't always believe what people tell you about these things. Dig into the sources, find out the truth. These are cool things, but there's a lot of rubbish spoken about them. So thanks a lot. I hope this has maybe taught you something. Maybe this is your introduction to the German butcher bayonet. They're really cool things to collect. And particularly if you can find one with the sawback on, they're even more desirable. So anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Please give me a thumbs up if you've enjoyed or learned something from this video. Make sure you're subscribed, and I hope you'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.